Hello, and welcome to our first Power Beyond Pride, a weekly queer change-making podcast, bringing you videos and ideas from across our fierce and fabulous spectrum to transform our world. Yes! I am Mattie Bynum, actress, comedian, activist, hostess with the mostest, and I am here tonight to enjoy myself first and foremost, but also to be a guide along with my co-host as we go on this queer journey. So at this time, I would like to introduce my co-hosts, and they are...
Hi, I'm Daniel W.K. Lee, poet, author, and psychic somnambulist.
And I'm Shane Lukas, and we are also proud to be voices in this movement. So I'm excited. My name's Shane Lukas, again, he, him, is, owner of Great Idea, lifelong harm reductionist and activist, and excited to join you all.
Hey, everybody. And last but certainly not least is Kenyon Farrow. That's me, he, him pronouns. I'm a writer and activist based in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'll tell you a little bit about the podcast. So each week on Power Beyond Pride podcast, we invite you to join us as two members of our host team welcome and get to know an LGBTQ activist, movement organizer, and inspiration that is actively transforming our world.
Once a month, and today for our first episode,
Woo!
some of us Power Beyond Pride hosts gather for what we call Reply All, where we focus on issues or questions impacting activists, share insights from our own work across communities, and take questions from the Power Beyond Pride mailbag.
So let's get started. Yeah, we're going to be checking the mail it's our first episode. So already people are contacting us. So that's pretty exciting. Since it's a first episode of this podcast, I got to know, when we first heard the phrase Power Beyond Pride, what does that mean to you?
Power Beyond Pride means power, political power, activism, including and thinking about ourselves as queer and trans folks, LGBTQ folks across the spectrum, but that our also power exists beyond that, right? And that part of the goal of this is to show the spectrum of the queer community, specifically, even as different kinds of activism in the guests that we bring, and even in us as hosts. I think that's a very powerful title.
I would say Power Beyond Pride for me is what happens after Pride, what happens after parades, what happens after festivals. What are you doing to still make your power and your presence be known in this world after the festivities are over? That's what I get from it.
Yeah, I just want to echo that for sure. Like this idea of 365 days of like how to exert political power or influence in order to kind of make the world better.
I think, pride is so fundamental to when we talk about queer people, that I think one of the things that I always worried about was it felt very narrow after a while. It felt like this became the only avenue in which we could talk about our values. And I think for me, I look at a lot of the early queer liberation movement, the people who really put a mark, whether it was Foucault or Sylvia Rivera or many of these different people who were out there doing on the ground work to bring communities together, to have conversations, to talk about intersectionality. And I think for me, I always saw Power Beyond Pride, and the idea of it was really trying to say, hey, this is a value. It's so important we show up in representation, that we show up confidently, that we show up as who we are in our authentic, true selves. But it's also important that we show up in ways about acceptance. We show up in ways about addressing racial inequality, that we address homelessness. We address many of these issues that many of our communities are facing. When we talk about immigration rights, we're really talking about our community members too, like that this is all part of the value system we have. I think, and Pride has somehow sort of become more condensed, I feel like, than I wish it were. I kind of feel like it started as a riot because it was a riot responding to so many things. And I kind of think of our power as so much bigger than that, because queer people are everywhere and we're doing so many cool things.
To extend that, why is it important to have this conversation about pride and power now, do you think?
They're trying to take all the power. They're trying to take all the power. All of it. Even the little bit of power that like queer people have had in terms of rights.
Yeah, they are.
They're trying to take it.
They are. I would definitely echo that. I would say the importance of this conversation now is because of the fact, I think, not just our power, but our ownership of ourselves in this season. Like we see a lot of issues being talked about pro-choice and women, but there's a lot of issues that are now going towards, especially transgender rights, gender confirmation, and all these different things. So I think to me, the importance of this conversation is to understand what power you do have so that way you can use it to continue to move the needle forward so we don't go backwards, but go forward.
Yeah, I also think it's important what we're doing to interview and bring in queer and trans folks who are activists in their own right around the country. I mean, some of the guests are more well known, and some of them are unsung heroes doing work in their communities. And I think for me, I in some ways feel very fortunate that as a kid growing up in Cleveland in a housing project, but there were lots of queer folks around, and folks were friends of my families, and I certainly understood homophobia in the world, but folks were also still very present and welcome and loved in my community in a way. But then it was being able to see when I first saw Marlon Riggs' film Tongues Untied when I was like 14 years old. My mom made us watch it, me and my sisters, on PBS. And being able to see those Black gay men, it was like, oh, that's the kind of, that's my path, right? That's who I want to be like. And so I think this podcast being able to present, not only celebrities or whatever, and we're in a different moment where there's a lot of queer folks around, but there's so much more that I think this podcast will help folks explore and discover.
Yeah, I think what you say, Kenyon, there's so many people coming out, which is awesome, right? It's great to see celebrities and people have this conversation. But I think we're not really talking about, at some ways, that the power that we get with that presence, but that when you think about housing rights, employment rights, when you think about all these places where power gets exercised, right? Pulling, when we talk about trans rights, right? We're talking about pulling them. We talk about athletes in schools, but that's not really the conversation. The conversation is, how can we reduce rights? How can we reduce access? How can we reduce the humanization of community members and really start this slippery slope about starting to pull people away from the human experiences and the human rights that everybody deserves? And so I feel like, to me, it's all about power. It's always been about, I'm a Foucauldian, so of course, it's always about power. Good sex is about power. It's power, right? They're power.
Hello.
So there's all power, intimacy, and gentleness and vulnerability, but like power, right? And so how do we how can we not talk about power at a moment where we're seeing those attacks really strike at the heart of so many people's individuals' ability to thrive on their terms? And to me, I think, again, Stonewall was about power. It was about showing a system that you were gonna exercise this moment. So I don't know. I just feel like that's what they want. They want us to feel powerless.
I just kind of follow up on that, this idea of about just focusing on power, which I think why now is so important is because this is also an opportunity to recalibrate the kind of ways in which we've been trying to quote unquote organize to assert some kind of agenda. I have plenty of critique of how we can call Gay Inc. has organized itself to further whatever the gay agenda is, and that and a kind of decades long enamorment of political power and trying to cozy up to it. And this is a time where we, I think, need to rethink that paradigm and return to this kind of grassroots power from below, so to speak. We were just talking about changes in pride, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But this almost reliance on corporate money is so different from the kind of radical roots of art, of liberation, that this moment, I think, is reckoning and recalibration.
Do you feel like the movement can encapsulate the wholeness of the queer identified populace? And I say this because you have intersections with privilege. You have intersections with whiteness and wealth. You have intersections at levels of low resource communities. You have different lived experiences that intersect with it. And so I think I worry because the history of all sort of movements has often been undone by those who move further forward fastest because they intersected with privilege and then turn around and do what I call ladder pulling, right? Which is, hey, I got here, so I guess you don't really need this special treatment, when in reality, we're not talking special treatment. We're talking equity. We're talking like everyone should have the ability to thrive on their terms. Do you think our movement can handle it?
I think that like,
I see your face, Mattie.
I think the idea of spontaneity of response, right, which was like a kind of a value, this idea in ACT UP organizing, like where there didn't have to be a consensus. Not everyone had to align and like with the same ideas. And I think that kind of proliferation, that kind of like mobilization of like spontaneity of response to kind of attack, so to speak, issues in different ways is very fruitful. I think the thing that we have to remember and learn from terms of our past mistake is, yes, there are those who come up in the front and then pull the ladder or take up the room or all the air, and then they're not being equitable partners in the kind of this spontaneous or multiplicity of a response. So yeah, I mean, I think like organizing Occupy Wall Street is an example of that. Maybe the short-sightedness was not an articulation of what their goals were, but it was very much this idea of like a large umbrella that kind of, you had people operating underneath it. And I thought that definitely changed the discourse. The 99%, like this kind of like class awareness became so prolific. So I'm not so cynical. I just think that we need to learn from this idea of, yes, this ladder pulling, we have to avoid that, or like taking up too much space and air in the room and not highlighting like I'm doing now. I'm going to shut up.
But I will say to echo that a little bit and to go a little bit deeper, I do think that the movement can handle it if we lean back into the fundamental of our movement, which is community. As long as we do it together. Because like, yeah, I hear you talking about the ladder pulling and taking up the space and the air, but sometimes we forget that it took a whole community to get us this far. So don't forget the roots of what we have and what we do use and where we're going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the movement can handle it. And also I think is increasingly necessary, right? I think what we've seen through waves of LGBT movement, especially when you get to the 1980s, where just as you described what happened, or I would say like the early 90s was, once the antiretroviral medications were available to people, there were a lot of wealthy white gay men who left the HIV movement, and some went to then fund some LGBT work, but that also then took on a very specific set of goals, marriage equality being one, right? And then didn't want to deal with these other kind of questions and other sort of issues that were impacting queer people. And even after the federal marriage equality happened as a Supreme Court decision, there were some similar dynamics that happened. There were some queer organizations that closed because funding was no longer available. Either their wealthier white gay donors got married, so they stopped funding those organizations and they closed, or other funders moved on to other things. And so but I think right now we're in such a particular moment where there is the potential for one, just a collapse, right? Real economic collapse. And I'm not even trying to be scary or hyperbolic, but that's really where we are. And that may, and in all our systems that a whole range of people rely on is at risk. It creates the conditions through which the kinds of solidarity that we need, where there may be various differences among race, gender identity, class, regions of the country, whatever, that even if, again, I think I like the kind of ACT UP example of folks being able to say, hey, we want to do this thing. And then if other folks didn't want to participate, then that group of people went and did it. And it was all ACT UP. So moving in that kind of solidarity and even political alignment, even if we don't necessarily think strategically in the same way is going to be really important.
We love what Kenyon left us with, so we're going to take a quick break, my babies. And then we're going to come back and finish the conversation about what does power mean to you, baby, okay? Oh, one moment.
Welcome back. This is Power Beyond Pride, a queer change-making podcast. I am Kenyon Farrow, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Shane, Daniel, and Mattie. And the news can be overwhelming right now, but we do want to dig a little deeper into some of the current events that we're living through in conversations.
Carrying on from our last conversation before the break, Pride Month is in June. So Pride season is kicking in, and we've got World Pride in DC. Carrying a little bit on our conversation about how Pride is shaped over the last several years, the buzz this year is that things are going to be tense. I don't know if anybody's got better words for it, but it sounds like it's going to be incredibly tense. Would anybody agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I agree.
So the presidential administration has already stripped Pride Month from federal recognition. And last month, the World Pride organizers have stated that they expect less participants from across the globe, and several events are already being hindered by the current administration. How is everybody feeling going into Pride Month?
Okay, I want to take this one. That's bullshit. That's what I want to say. I really want to say that's bullshit. I really do, because this is why I feel about, why are we stripping Pride Month? Because if that's the case, then what the hell do we have pride of? Because to me, I look at it like this. The United States, to me, is stripping everything that I would be proud of to say I am an American about. And so to strip Pride Month from anything and to try to either cancel it or to downplay it, to me, I think is honestly bullshit, because that's who we are.
It's such a tough moment right now, Mattie, because I think right now, even our allies and accomplices feel a bit conflicted, not because they don't support many of us, but because there's I'll say here in North Carolina, for example, the North Carolinian state legislature has now outlawed, essentially, we might as well call it outlawed, things like DEI, and included within that is the celebration of queer people, so much so that they're going to go after them at a legal front if they go ahead and show support in these categories. And so it's kind of scared, and I don't know even the extent of the ways in which the state could go after them, but it's scared some cities, some regions, because they're nervous about seeing that kind of attention. And I think they want to show up, but there could be prosecution for showing up as an institution. So I don't know how to get our accomplices on board in this moment. So Kenyon, do you have any thoughts on that, especially there in Ohio?
Yeah, I think here, at least it's been reported, the Cincinnati, Ohio's Pride, that they were struggling to raise money because corporate sponsors were not wanting to donate this year for really, I think, fear of reprisal from some level of this organization, from the administration, whether Doge or whatever, right? And so you've had a line, we've seen that in some other cities around the country, right, that have also said as much. And so that's one piece that's happening. But I think also the question of whether, sometimes I was just actually talking to my realtor actually the other day. He was a straight white guy and has come to Pride before, him and his wife or whatever. And so questions about whether folks who aren't even queer will support this year because of not just, this part of it is fear of what the sort of federal government is doing, but then there's the downstream fears about vigilante attacks or police or frankly ICE raids showing up at Pride and just grabbing people who look Latino or brown or what have you. And so I do think there's some real questions that people, that they have created a condition where people, I think, have some real legitimate things to be fearful of. Now, the corporations, I have no, fuck them, right? To a certain extent, because
they
actually have the most leverage, right, in this moment. A lot of those CEOs are just billionaires, just like Elon Musk, right? But they have kowtowed regardless. And so, but for, kind of individuals, or even for smaller organizations or those sort of things. I do think that there's some, or even for queer people I know who are saying that they're not going to Pride celebrations this year for fear of all the things I already named. It has created a sense of fear in a lot of folks.
I think there are two, specifically for New Orleans. New Orleans Pride has never really been like a corporate sponsored kind of hullabaloo. It's been local sponsors and stuff like that. And I think maybe one, no, not surprisingly, like an energy company trying to like greenwash themselves. But otherwise, it's not really brought to, not like Jazz Fest where it's brought to you by Shell. So that kind of thing, it's not, at least to my knowledge, it hasn't really been so reliant on corporate money. And I suspect this is a kind of recalibration that I think is worthwhile. Continuing what I was saying earlier, that like this reliance on corporate money or like even appeasement towards it, like it's the teat in which we were trying to feed our movement is perhaps a really kind of in a long term, like it's been wrong-headed for us for a generation, or so. And I guess I'm not particularly, aside from possible like legal ramifications, I kind of feel like Pride is the toothpaste out of the tube. The administration can be like, oh, we don't officially recognize it on a federal level anymore. Okay, whatever. Everyone knows what Pride is. And Pride wasn't giving me a month off. Pride wasn't giving me a stipend or something like that. So there wasn't kind of a material thing that that improved my life per se. I just think of like, well, the cat's already out of the bag. You can take it off the website or whatever, but everyone knows Pride is June. So that part doesn't really mean all that much to me. What I think is, for me, more important is the kind of this recalibration, that like saying, all right, the corporate partners, quote unquote, corporate allies, if you want to jokingly call it, right? They, as Kenyon was saying, they're obsequious. They kowtowed and were pre-compliant. Target has gotten biggest hit from pulling their DEI. Walmart has done so too. So many of these companies have. How do we take steps forward and be pragmatic on, instead of being like, woe is us? Now what? I'm glad for these prides who have been like, all right, we need to pivot. We need to raise funds from the community, just like we used to do, right?
Yeah, so it makes you wonder that because to your point, which I forgot to mention, the Cincinnati Pride, that's part of what their strategy was when they realized that they were losing lots of their corporate sponsors. They decided to community fundraise, and it's still going to happen as Pride. But then there's a question of not just where the money sometimes impacts the program and the experience and what people do, but then there's just the question of you can have a community funded Pride and it still be apolitical, right? So it may not have big splashy branded corporate sponsored things, but so the question then is, should Pride be political again? And I guess what would that look like now in 2025?
New York has had that kind of the alternative Pride, like their queer march. That's not the corporate Pride, where it's just like activists marching on the streets and stuff like that.
It's Reclaim Pride. Yeah,
Reclaim Pride. Right, I forgot what it was called, but like more of that, please. Sure, I have no problem with that.
Part of me wants to bring it back to the idea that it was prompting difficult conversations. It was prompting the presence of, it wasn't looking for acceptance. It was looking for you to understand there's a diversity of identities and people with lived experiences here, and there's room for us all. And I think it demanded it. And I think we've stopped demanding it and we started asking for it. And that's the part I think I'm most uncomfortable with Pride, is that, again, I can't throw enough love at the leather community, at Dykes on Bikes, at the courage and the boldness of community members who stepped up when it was the most difficult, and then watch those same community members be like, oh, I don't know, is this family friendly? Is this a thing that needs to do X and Y? What? You know what's not family friendly? Taking people's rights away. That's not family friendly. What's not family friendly is making people invisible. That's not family friendly. These are things that we should be looking at as values in our system and say, this is the stuff that matters. And I feel like we've stepped so far into like wanting Citibank to show up or Delta to sponsor something that we have forgotten what it was that we were here for in the first place. I want to see it come back in such a way as to say, no, we want our communities to stand up for the values, not just the rainbow washing.
100%.
Honestly, I'm just going to be honest. I really don't think politics should be in Pride, period. And I may be off topic. I don't know. But I really don't think politics should be in Pride. I think because when I think of Pride, I'm an old Southern girl. So I feel like Pride is a big family reunion. That's really what I feel like Pride is. Pride is the time that you can come and just have fun and connect back with your community, show up for who you are, stand and be vigilant in your own self. But why does politics have to be in it? Like, why does this even have to be something that we have to discuss politically? Because at the end of the day, we all have some form of pride. Like, whether it is the LGBT community, the ally community, like, it's just about just showing your love and your pride in general. So, yeah, that's my stance. I don't think politics should be in a period.
Hot take.
Hot take.
Hottest take.
Just being honest.
I would say, answering my own question, I do think that pride should be political. But I also think that it doesn't have to just be political, right? And I think it never was just political. I think it has to be political. It certainly started that way. There was a necessity. And in a way, we still have a lot of just political issues that impact our community. And so I think we need to make that statement. And I'll use Cleveland Pride, where I live, Pride in the CLE. It's a little bit of both. We've maintained a pride that is a march, right? It's not just, and even in terms of the march itself, there aren't a ton of big corporate sponsors. We do have some corporate sponsors, but not everything is branded that way. And we don't have really big floats, like everybody marches. And so if there are people march with their companies or whatever, and we also don't segment it off, which I've seen other big prides do, where it's like all the corporate sponsors in one place, then it's like the activists get one space, and then the HIV orgs get one space, like, and so no, it's like the Cleveland Cavs are marching with the DSA chapter, right? Next to them, right? It's a mix. And then it ends in like a kind of a festival where there's a stage with performers or whatever. And then there's another stage that's a community speak out. Anybody can jump up on that stage and talk about whatever they want, right? So we are able to maintain, I think, both. And it has a kind of family reunion. Like it's very much about connecting to folks. And so I think you can do both. I don't think it has to be, I think that we think about politics or political stuff just as like, but that's often not the thing. Even as somebody who comes from an organizing background, that's often not that's important to make political stances, but also if you're trying to mobilize the community, you need other tactics. That I always say use the Black Panthers, right? Part of the attraction of the Black Panthers was because they looked fucking hot. They were in these black leather jackets and Tams and like boots and like, you know what I mean? Like you gotta have like, part of the attraction was like they looked sexy and people wanted to be down with something that looked cool. And I think sometimes a lot of our politics as avowed leftists gets very bogged down in kind of jargon and finger pointing and like you're problematic and all this stuff. And I do think that's something that right has leveraged against us in ways that I think in some respects they've been right about. Like in terms of how sometimes those things dissuade people from being able to feel like they can be a part of something. So I think we have to both be political, make the kind of clear political stance, especially right now, clear, and then move to then create spaces where people then can celebrate and feel like they can kind of, show up fully in other kind of ways.
Now, Kenyon, I will say this, just to comment on something you just said, the Black Panthers were hot and sexy. Now, I do believe they were hot because if you think of leather in Oakland in California in the summertime with no deodorant, yes, that's a hot mess. Sexy, I'm not for sure, but hot, yeah, that made me hot just thinking about it, okay?
Huey Newton, right, hot, right? Kathleen Cleaver, hot, right? Elaine Brown, hot.
I mean, Shaka Khan, you don't forget Shaka. Shaka Khan, yes.
Was a Black Panther and drop dead gorgeous. Yeah. So I do think that there's something in that I think we are missing now in our political moment.
Before we take a break, I'm just going to chime in one really quick here about, like, are we falling into I don't know, maybe it is a more theoretical thought, but like this idea of the personal is political. Queer celebration in a context now is political. You are defying this political architecture and narrative that seeks to erase queerness, transness, everything. So your celebration is political anyways. So I don't think that there is particularly any useful division between this idea of like the personal and or joy and politics and pride. If anything, let's problematize the idea of what pride is in terms of a commercial package, but embrace your celebration as a political act and like let that be amplified, because I'm not so convinced that we can step outside of politics in that regard, not when you're already directly under threat.
They don't want us to be happy. Like, I think like that celebration is an act of political defiance. And I think to show fulfillment, to show joy, to show connection, to show community, Mattie, right? That is in some ways political in a time where they're trying to tear apart so many parts of our communities.
We need to take a break again, so we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Power Beyond Pride. I am Shane, here with my co-hosts, Kenyon, Mattie, and Daniel, and we are queer change makers ourselves. It's time to check the mailbag for your questions.
So our first question, and y'all, I would like to take this time to just say, since this is our first episode and our first question, the first thing that popped in my mind was Betty Wright when she made the song going back to her very first time. So I want y'all to keep that in mind as we go through these questions about your very first time. Now, coming from our queer activist icon, Annie Sprinkle. That Annie Sprinkle, you know, I love her to death. She's such a sweetheart. Hi, Annie. Thank you for listening and leading the way for Power Beyond Pride. Here's what she had to say.
Hi, I'm Annie Sprinkle, and I'm she, her mostly, and I'm based in San Francisco and the Santa Cruz Redwood Forest. And I'm wondering, like, what can we do to ignite more environmental activism in the queer movement? We're filmmakers who make queer environmental films, but there are hardly any, like, there's Patagonia and there's a few, but why are queers, GLBTQ, not more environmentally conscious activists? And without clean water, we're done for. Without good air, you know, these are important umbrella issues, and yet we could do more. And so why not add the E to GLBTQIE?
E for ecosexual.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool.
So I'm going to pose this question back to my host. So who would like to take the first answer?
I mean, my comical, cynical answer is when these gays have no forest to cruise in, then... I'll just play it. So, let me go for a real answer. Well, I think that how you do it, I don't know exactly. But I also would say, I don't necessarily think that there is we've seen like a sort of a visible queer kind of climate justice, environmental justice sort of space open up. But I absolutely know queer folks who are absolutely, their work is in climate justice and environmental justice. And so I think it also depends on how you view it or what you see. Because some of the environmental work, to me, or kind of climate work, is like, you know, the work that folks do in Louisiana around Cancer Alley, right? And so I think like, I think some of it is also we have to think differently about what we see as climate and environmental work. And there are folks there doing that work. But But I do think it is an interesting question, I think, to think about what is a kind of queer voice as a kind of organized movement of queer folks moving strategically around climate and environmental justice, and how we get there. I'm interested to know what y'all think, but my first part was a little kiki.
I mean, you're not wrong. One thing that's interesting, Kenyon, that you shared is I'd even pull it back, because when you think about queerness and even just the natural space in the natural world, I think a lot of queer people at different points in the movement, and I'll go back to the Radical Fae movement, the Radical Fairies movement, and other movements have really come back to sort of look at nature and sort of the fundamental queerness within nature, that nature itself has so many variations and different ways of being, that I think many people, as they went through their journeys in their own queer experience, oftentimes framed it from a natural context. And then I don't know if people have made a lot of leaps into the climate work, but like you said, I know a lot of queer people in the climate space, and their relationship to nature feels very personal. Their relationship to nature feels like in some ways they could be safe, they could be seen, they could be embraced for kind of what felt like, hey, the world wants you to conform to this one way, but nature has all these other ways to be. So I think bringing some of that in is also this recognition, like, kind of nature's queer, and it's always been queer, and many of our queer movements have looked to nature to influence them. And so I think it makes sense also to come back to the climate mitigation work and be like, hey, yeah, there are a lot of us who are in touch with nature and spend our time in nature, not just to cruise, to find great things. And I think recognizing that queerness is part of that experience, I think, is powerful. I just look at so many legacies in the queer movement that are tied to the natural.
Perhaps this is a challenge of messaging that even like people in climate activism in general kind of have to wrangle with, that where do we take the issue of environmentalism and bring it home, right? When people have competing priorities or hierarchy of needs, and like that articulation of, you're not going to have water, or you're in a place where you're going to be 6 times more likely to have cancer. I think those are those like discursive points that we have to like be able to bridge with queer activists who are saying maybe only exclusively work in that space. And I think it's not just environmental activists, of course. It's just an overall strategy of like how we create this sense of immediacy. I want to always believe that we are driven by values. But one of the first things you'll really learn about politics and is this adage from when Benjamin Franklin, he said, if you should persuade, convince my interest, not my intellect. And that's certainly how how politics have been really going for quite a while. Like, how does it serve me? How does it affect my household? The ones who want us to move for values kind of have to be able to at least speak in a way that engages people who are driven by interest, and find a way to kind of bridge those two and maybe marry them together. I think what people who are like ideologically driven, that's where they kind of fall short of, because they haven't figured out a way to talk to people where they are in terms of their needs or their wants, rather than trying to like either chastise them, or like a lot of voters and stuff like that are just like this lizard brain, it's not about, it's more knee jerk, or it's more self-involved in a way. So yeah, that would be my 4 cents on like how to engage people into like any kind of like overlapping activism that's beyond whatever's in your wheelhouse.
That feels like an argument for Kenyans. Just tell them that they can't cruise in the woods anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. Exactly.
That is not the intellect. That is not the intellect putting them in the woods. That's all I'm saying.
But you know what? It's enough outrage. That kind of thing is, oh, you're taking what away from me? The ramble or the rack? We can't have that.
Right.
Honestly,
Yeah.
right?
No, I mean, it's self-interest is a powerful motivator. And last thing I'll say too is Jenny, you were talking to me think too about, to this point I was making earlier about like having to really think about how we think about climate and environmental work. So for instance, in Atlanta, all of that organizing to stop Cop City that happened in the last couple of years in Atlanta, a big part of the messaging there was about the destruction of forest land around that community. And I personally know a lot of Black queer folks in Atlanta who were the leading organizers in a lot of that Stop Cop City work. And so I also think like sometimes a certain kind of environmentalism that like, or environmental sort of justice work that thinking about, forests and oceans and these things, and that those things are actually really critical. But I think particularly in a lot of Black and brown communities, the issues are more acute in that land is being taken to develop things or to push people out of land or to dump toxic lead filled crap into people's neighborhoods. And so the work looks different in that sense, but it's still climate work. And I think that's the space where I think you see a lot of queer folks, even if it's not like has a clear kind of queer specific messaging, because a lot of queer folks, I think, in some of that work that's about the ways in which like people in certain poor communities have to then deal with business interests that displace them and move them into toxic lands or dump things in their neighborhoods or drive highways through their communities that then creates asthma and all these other kind of conditions that people in those neighborhoods live through.
Well, I think what you hit on there, Kenyon, actually gets to our next question in our mailbag. So I think we can probably carry that through to this interesting question that comes from another ecosexual artist activist, Beth Stevens, who's a co-author with Sprinkle. And Beth asks,
and I'm Beth Stevens, and my pronouns are she, they, be, and so on. Anyhow, I'm in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco with Annie. And my question is, how can the queer community have a solidarity amongst themselves without infighting? I know a lot of political movements are really taken down by infighting. And so how do we as queers maintain our individual passions and individual identities and individual identity politics and still move forward as a cohesive political movement, right? How do we fight without destroying our cohesiveness? That's my question for the movement.
So this to me kind of speaks to again, I was thinking, Kenyon, this would kind of speak to the idea that there's different people kind of moving toward different things in the same movement. How can we go forward for the loving, cohesive movement, even if we have major differences within the movement?
I think this is huge for us right now. I think that we are in a moment of reckoning with respect to organizing. I know that like folks who aren't in the kind of like decolonial pro-Palestine camp or who don't see like that the kind of really baseline human rights of it all that's happening now see really a moral bankruptcy outside of it. And I can see that I totally understand why, because there is a sense that your compassion or your view and vision of your work has boundaries, and or even your empathy and your sympathy has national boundaries, and it doesn't extend to like genocidal acts happening someplace else. And so like this actually also comes close to like what I was saying earlier with Gay Inc. So Human Rights Campaign, ironically, maybe not ironically, they take money from Raytheon, I believe, arms makers. There's these fractures, these fissures in the movement that I think that are going to be very difficult to overcome as we kind of consider how people align. I don't think the cohesion is necessary other than like making sure people are just doing. ACT UP was like, oh, you're not interested in like this action? You can stay home. We're going to do it. And under this umbrella of queerness and the queer movement, you can have people doing all kinds of things or whatever. And I'm not convinced either that like we need to have a consensus about it, right? I think more important is to kind of do the action. And if you keep on walking and others has to kind of, swerve a little bit more to kind of figure out their own path, I think that's fine. But yeah, I mean, and I'm going to go back. I do think this intellectual thing, but like not recognizing, for example, another kind of intellectual hurdle, not recognizing intersectionality or decolonial practice. These are obstacles of kind of a unified kind of movement. But I just think keep on going. Just keep on.
And I agree with that. Like when I hear this question, the first thing I think is, first off, because me being me, loving to be different and out loud, but I think we should lean into our differences. I think that's what makes us unique and beautiful and special. To be cohesive, to move forward, is to understanding that in our community and in all communities, it's the differences that bring us together. Because I might be loud, out loud, proud, and funny. But the beauty of Daniel is he's very intellectual, smart, intelligent, and funny at the same time. So where there might be some cohesiveness, shut up, Shay. There might be some cohesiveness, but the difference is what makes us a full package. So I think if as a community, if we come together with our differences, that's what makes us dynamic in the first place.
Yeah, I would say too, just quickly, I think that the one way to do that, and I agree with y'all, but I don't think that we all have to be on the same page. We all don't all have to move in a kind of lockstep unison as such. But I think that one of the things that I think that will help maybe things feel a little bit more like a community, which I would say, to me, I feel like the queer community has felt less of for me in the last 10 or 15 years than more than it did in the 90s when I was coming out and running around, and even the early 2000s. And I do honestly think that some of it is digital space and the ways in which filtered behind phones and laptops and screens or whatever, it's easier. And also because the media has helped in that sense, and these platforms have very much hyper segmented audiences and communities to the extent to which I think it then makes it easier for people to be I am and you aren't, right? And the kind of tensions and drama you see on social media, which and there's a whole lot of running jokes that we all have had about people. You meet people who are like these real fierce keyboard warriors who are cussing everybody out online. And I've met people in person and be like, you are not this person, right? You are not this person. For better or for worse, you're not like, you're very different in real time. And I think that we really do also have to invest going back to real time relationship building with people. And because that is often how you break through relational challenges and able to either build a stronger relationship, develop a relationship, or even in ways that with principles say we're not in alignment and it's you over there and I'm over here, whatever the deal is. But I do think that something like the social media has changed things that I think that actually does make it has intensified a certain kind of isolation, which has also had impacts on how we experience community, if we experience it at all anymore.
Yeah. And I think what you raised too, Kenyon, is that how we build community is the loving, cohesive part, I think is really powerful to think about in this statement, because I think in movement work, particularly, a lot of coalitions sort of die on the vine because people don't go into the conversation with this idea of sort of, we have to have our open hearts and our compassion, but we also need to understand we don't necessarily all need to be on each other's greeting card list when this is over.
Right.
Like at some juncture, we need to actually have an agreement about what we're here to do, so that you're right. Like we're all not going to be the same. We're in fact, our multiplicity that makes us a vital, rich, and vibrant sets of communities, right? Like that's what's awesome. But we have to agree on what the goal is. Like we have to have the cohesive element is like, hey, here's the thing that we can all agree we need to accomplish. And that we can come into this lovingly, open-hearted, and understand that we may not have the same faith. We may not have the same lived experience. And we might not even like each other. Like sometimes in movement work, you don't need to like the people you're in coalition with. You share what the outcome is. because the people who benefit from that work aren't the people in the room. Like the people who benefit from that room they do not care what your personal interests are. What they care about is that they access food, they accessed an education, they were able to get the healthcare the gender affirming healthcare that they wanted, whatever, but that they got that. That's the goal. The goal is not your Christmas card list. The goal is like, this is the stuff. But you can do that with love. You can do that and say, I may not always agree with you. I can still care about you and I can still care that you're well. But here are the things that we need to accomplish. That's the part I wish we would kind of come back to a little bit, is like there were people in the early parts of let's say we talked about ACT UP a lot today, but like in ACT UP, there were a lot of people who did not get along, but they understood the immediacy, the urgency, the necessity of finding an accord, even at the most sort of like, I don't need to like you, but we are all in this at some level together. I'm hoping we can do that.
Yeah, because Lord knows there are people I work with all the time that I cannot fucking stand.
I see you looking at me.
Well,
I see you looking at me.
How you really feel? Look.
You're, in coalitions with people or people who you just are not, you don't rock with, right? For a range of reasons. But you are there to do a specific set of things and you figure it out. Moving right along. I love y'all, by the way.
We thank you all for these wonderful questions. And like I said, don't ever hesitate to send us more questions. We love to answer these questions because that's what the conversation is about. That's what this podcast is about. Power Beyond Pride is, how do we make pride extend further? How do we make our power continue to grow and be more intense than the Cheeto man in the White House? How do we continue to, break boundaries and cover new land like Ellen Musty? Like, it's just so much that we got to accomplish. So we thank you so much. So please send all your questions to mailbag@powerbeyondpride.com. Or you can visit our beautiful powerbeyondpride.com website and submit your questions there, okay?
Or even better, send us a video, safe for work video, to any of our social channels.
No NSFWs.
We want to see you. We want to hear you and be in community with you. That's all the time we have for this Reply All, our first episode of Power Beyond Pride. That really went by so fast. I am your co-host, Daniel W.K. Lee, poet and author and monochromatic church lady. You can find me at Daniel W.K. Lee on Blue Sky, and I'm so thankful to be here with my wonderful co-hosts.
And I am Mattie Bynum, actress, comedian, and one of the original Still Magnolias of the South, yes. Remember to subscribe and get your friends and family to subscribe to Power and Beyond Pride on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our site at powerbeyondpride.com.
And I am your co-host, Kenyon Farrow, writer and activist. And you can find me pretty much on all the socials, just at my name, at Kenyon Farrow.
And I am your co-host, Shane Lukas. I am a lifelong activist, harm reductionist, and I was the chorus boy in Annie Get Your Gun community theater production in my high school. Yes, there you go. You got it. You can follow me at shanelukas.com. You can check out more. Remember to also subscribe and get your friends to subscribe to Power Beyond Pride on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out the site, as Mattie said, on powerbeyondpride.com.
Power Beyond Pride is a project of A Great Idea, a queer-owned design and content agency. Learn more about them at agreatidea.com.
And this episode is produced by Shane Lukas, one of our current hosts. Smita Sarka is our project developer, and our amazing editor is Jared Redding, and he is always supported by the most wonderful Ian Wilson.
We are all a part of this podcast awesome host team. And so again, remember to send your questions and comments at powerbeyondpride.com.
Check out our new episodes each week, and we look forward to queer change making with you next time. Thank you from all of us at Power Beyond Pride, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Woo!